Hello, and welcome to Celestix Network's presentation on the myth of the secured password. As a global IT security leader, our unique perspective enables us to understand the various threats and challenges faced by a wide variety of businesses, from the small and medium-sized businesses up to our enterprise customers. In our presentation today, we'll talk about the myths and challenges around password security, steps you can take to improve your own password and application security, and also provide you with tools for your users. I will be your presenter for today. My name is Benjamin Derr, and I'm a senior sales engineer with Celestix Networks. I've spent the last 10 years in information technology security consulting, performing a wide range of security functions for my customers, but with a primary focus on identity and access management. Prior to consulting, I spent 12 years with the United States Air Force, focusing on information technology and security. During my time with the Air Force, I worked hand in hand with the NSA to develop infrastructure hardening standards for a wide variety of Microsoft applications. These guys were primarily focused for the public sector. During my time with the Air Force, I worked hand in hand with the NSA to develop infrastructure hardening guides, typically around a wide variety of Microsoft-based applications. These guides were primarily written for use by the private sector. In our discussion today, we'll talk about some of the news and trends that you may be aware of. We'll talk about where your passwords are vulnerable and how you can reduce those vulnerabilities. And we'll talk about the importance of improved authentication and how to layer on additional authentication processes through the use of two-factor. Finally, we'll talk about our offer for you around our two-factor authentication, as well as our downloadable document to help your users improve their password security. Not a day goes by that we don't learn about another breach with a company that we trust with our own personal data. These are companies that we often do business with, but we may also entrust with our personal data. Something to take away from these attacks, though, is the amount of data that is being compromised. In the case of Adobe, 3 million accounts were compromised. Recently, we learned that that has actually been increased to 38 million. In the case of the Evernote hack, 50 million accounts are compromised. So what's becoming obvious with these attacks is that they're becoming more verbose, and the amount of data being exposed becomes larger and larger. Recently, Symantec did a study and looked at several of the trends and emerging patterns from the last few years. What they have found was actually very startling. Target attacks have increased by 42% from last year. Vulnerabilities still continue to grow, and the average number of identities exposed has been increasing year over year. In addition, not only do our applications have vulnerability points, but also the devices that we use to access these applications, such as the mobile device market and consumer devices. The vulnerabilities on these mobile devices continue to increase year over year, namely because of the functionality that we require and expect from these devices, and the software that we install that may or may not be trustworthy. Lastly, one of the more concerning trends from the report is where attackers are focusing their efforts on. Traditionally, we've often thought of the enterprise space as being the prime target for attackers, but no longer is that true, and attackers are moving down the stack to the mid-tier and SMB market space. Furthermore, in this report documented that 116 unique businesses will be targeted daily by attackers. Out of these 116 businesses that are being targeted, 60% will fail, primarily due to loss of financial data or loss of intellectual property. So the takeaway from these trends is that while we may not think we're a target or our company is not a target, in fact we are, and it could happen tomorrow. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, it could happen the next week. So we need to take the actions to protect our resources today. Starting from the early days of computing to today, passwords have been a prevalent part of our computing life. In fact, even more so now with the explosion in the growth of internet and internet-related services. In fact, Microsoft did a research study back in 2007 that found that back then, the average user had 25 separate accounts, 6.5 passwords, and 8 different passwords are used daily. I myself have 65 different passwords I have to manage. Couple that with the explosion of mobile consumer devices and the challenges that they present with authentication and credential storage, you can see why that they are more vulnerable today. So the question begets, why are passwords more vulnerable today? We've had passwords since the mainframe days. We've used them as our primary source of authentication. Why are they a challenge now? And the answer is users have more passwords to manage on a day-to-day basis. They have more passwords to account for and remember and memorize. Each service has its own password constraints and requirements around the usage of passwords. And therefore, users go down the path of least complexity and will reuse common passwords, or you keep passwords simple, or do simple character password replacement. These are all bad practices with passwords and thus lead to the compromises we see today. You couple password management with mobile and consumer devices and the challenges with those devices, and you can see a recipe for a perfect storm of vulnerabilities. All these operating system variants pose various challenges to authentication and also credential management. How are these devices storing credentials? How are they encrypting these credentials? How are users able to access the credentials? These are all challenges that we face with our devices. Furthermore, as users are using these devices in their business life, they are bringing these same threats into the network. Remember the security axiom: a threat accepted by one is a threat accepted by all. So let's take a look at where passwords are actually vulnerable. When we think of password vulnerabilities, we can think of them in three distinct layers: in transit, at the application, and at the user or locally exposed. In transit, this will be from the user device or user workstation to the application server as it rides along the network here. And our threats here are mainly more technical and a little more difficult to pull off, but yet are still threats that we need to be careful about. Traffic sniffing, man-in-the-middle, phishing attacks, these are all threats that are very real and carried out on a daily basis, and exposed on a daily basis. The man-in-the-middle and the phishing attacks are the attacks that are more likely to succeed. We've all seen phishing attack emails. I'm sure our users have received them, but they wouldn't be used today if they weren't effective. Man-in-the-middle attacks are slightly more complicated, but will typically involve rerouting traffic to a rogue server that is intercepting and decrypting traffic. This attack may actually be unwittingly instigated by the user by installing adware or download accelerators or other rogue programs. Password vulnerability at the application layer involves more technical attacks against the application. Session hijacking involves taking over an authenticated session from a legitimate user. Brute force attacks are the most common type of attacks against application servers. These typically involve attacks at the authentication login process and involve throwing large numbers of random passwords at the system, hoping for one that will actually work. The last four, with application weaknesses, password hashing, SQL injection attacks, and software code vulnerabilities, are actions that we can take to fix our application weaknesses, thereby improving password security. Password hashing techniques, if you're not familiar, involves the hashing of the user password so that it's not decryptable by an attacker if they were gaining access to that identity store. In fact, the recent Adobe compromise, they found that the passwords were stored using reversible encryption, which is not a good practice. In fact, passwords should be hashed using a one-way algorithm that can only be matched with the same password. Locally exposed passwords are typically exposed by the users either knowingly or unknowingly. They may be unknowingly exposed through the use of malware, such as rootkits or keyloggers. I heard an interesting story a while ago where gangsters in New York were actually paying janitors to install keyloggers onto targets' machines for the use of blackmail. So even though users may not be knowingly exposing themselves to these risks, they may be happening through third parties. Users will often commonly write down passwords. This is very common with obviously the number of passwords that we have to manage on a day-to-day basis. But writing them down is not so much a security risk, but how are they securing those written down passwords? Common passwords involves reusing the same password for various other systems. For example, using the same password for your Twitter account, your Facebook account, and your Snapchat account. In fact, most users will probably reuse the same password that they are using to authenticate to your systems as they are for their personal life. The last three items here involve more targeted attacks toward a particular individual, and usually will be more targeted to a higher level member of your organization. For example, the chief executive or chief information officer. So the question becomes, how do we mitigate password weaknesses? And there's really 5 distinct areas that we can look at to increase our password security. Number 1, we can fix or improve our application security. However, this is costing time intensive and may not always be feasible, even with internally developed applications, depending upon budget and development skills. We can move to a relatively new model that's gaining acceptance, which is called Authenticate the Transaction and not the user. With transaction authentication, we take a baseline of normal user behavior and then use that to inspect future transactions and look for anomalous behaviors. This is really similar to when you use a credit card and if a rogue charge shows up, such as a charge from an overseas location, your credit card company will call you or text you and ask you if that charge is legitimate. This model is more intrusive to the end user, it's more expensive to maintain, and it's not suitable for high transaction volumes due to the nature of being able to baseline the user behavior. We can restrict access to known good devices. This is a practice that has wide acceptance in the enterprise space and even some of the mid-tier market spaces. However, it requires an organization to be able to manage the entire life cycle of the devices in their environment, from the laptops and desktops to mobile device issuance. It requires you as an organization to understand and control these user devices. It will often require the use of a mobile device management solution. And this is not feasible for partners or consumer devices, since you do not have control of their devices. We can continue down the path of educating the user. I will always say that we need to keep educating the users. Even though we've been doing it for the past 15 years, people still are susceptible to scams, to phishing attempts, or to give up their passwords or practice poor security fundamentals. But these are things that we as IT professionals still need to work on and educate our user base. And lastly, from an authentication process, we can enable two-factor strong authentication, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. It's really the easiest path to mitigating our weaknesses. It's most cost-effective, and it works with the existing infrastructure. Two-factor is simply a way of adding an additional authentication process on top of what users normally use today. So let's take a look at what is two-factor authentication. Simply put, two-factor authentication is something you know and something you have. Something you know would be your Active Directory username and password. And something you have is a smartphone or a hard token that only you would have to have possession of. There's about 6 different flavors of two-factor, although there's some other niche players too as well. The most common flavors of two-factor authentication are one-time passwords, hard tokens, and certificate-based authentication. Smart cards fall along into that certificate-based authentication model as well. Biometrics and knowledge-based two-factor authentication have come around recently, even though the technology is still maturing. As organizations look for ways to improve application security and authentication models, two-factor will become more prevalent in the use of organizations. We've seen it in Asia with wide adoption rates, and in Europe with the banking industry mandating the use of two-factor hard tokens. As information security professionals, we are charged with ensuring the security of our business applications. As such, we need to be aware of the two-factor solutions out there in the market and start evaluating and determining which is best for our business. So let's review some of the things that we've talked about today. We know that the SMB segment is being targeted more and more frequently. Even if you haven't been targeted today or in the past, chances are very good that you'll be targeted in the future. And the reasons are quite simple. There are more targets in the SMB space, and attackers understand that there is not the same level of resources as an enterprise target would have in securing their applications. 60% of these organizations will fail after an attack, so we want to make sure that we understand the threats and properly secure applications. We understand from a password vulnerability standpoint, users have more accounts and more passwords to manage than ever before, and it's just going to increase in the future. Passwords are always traditionally the weak point in security, as we rely on users to create their strong passwords. User password is construction, but it's not the fail-safe. We can mandate 15-character passwords, but then we'd be in a situation where these passwords would be simpler to crack. Implementing a two-factor authentication solution provides an additional authentication process that helps mitigate weak and insecure passwords. And any solution that you evaluate should be easy to implement and use wherever static passwords are vulnerable. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have a couple of takeaways for you today. First is our downloadable document that you can use to pass to users for just teaching the fundamentals of basic password security. This document is free for you to give to your users, and we highly recommend that you do so. Secondly, we are offering a discount on our HotPin solution, which is our two-factor authentication solution. What we're offering is $1 per user per year for the first year with a 3-year subscription. If you are interested, we'd be delighted to take the opportunity to talk with you about your security needs and authentication challenges. Feel free to reach out to our sales department either through our website or our email or through our phone number. Thank you for attending today, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation on the myth of the secured password.